Hello everyone. In this video I want to talk about exposure and exposure settings, and specifically how I approach setting exposure for a photograph. Now there's a lot of videos already on YouTube about the exposure triangle, how exposure works in a camera and what the basic settings on a camera do. And even though those are already out there and there's really no need for an additional one, I'm going to go over the basics really quickly, partly just to be complete in what I'm covering in this video, and also partly because it's a really good way to learn, to explain what you've learned and make sure that you can teach it to someone else. That's a really good way to sort of make it sink into your brain and prove to yourself that you know what you're talking about. So exposure refers to the light that's collected by a camera when you're taking a picture. In the days before digital photography, this was done with a piece of film, and the film was sensitive to light, so when light hits the film, it records the image that is being presented by the light. Now that we have digital photography, it actually is pretty similar. Ultimately, you just have a piece of material in the camera that is sensitive to light. In the case of digital photography, and it's not film, it's a photosensor, which is just a piece of metal that is sensitive to light and can take the light that's hitting it and translate that into electrical signals, which can then be recorded digitally. So in your digital camera, you have a photosensor that is made up of all these tiny little points called photosites, each of which records the amount of light that's hitting it. That can be translated into an image based on the amount of light that hits each point. Essentially, you can think of that as somewhat translating to a pixel in the image that you ultimately have on your computer. There's three main attributes that you can control on your camera that affects the exposure, and those attributes are aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, sometimes called ISO. You'll often hear the relationship between these three attributes referred to as the exposure triangle, because you can kind of think of these three related attributes that all affect exposure as points on a triangle that all affect exposure being the value in the center. All three of these can increase the exposure, increase the amount of light that's hitting the sensor in your camera, and all three of them can decrease the amount of light that's being recorded. So why do we need three different forms? Well, it's helpful to understand what they actually are, so let me describe that briefly. Aperture refers to the size of the opening in your lens at the front. So you have an iris in your lens that can be closed down to let in less light. And at a high aperture value, when the iris is very open, it's letting in more light. And as you start to close it down, it decreases the amount of light, which effectively darkens the image. The shutter speed refers to simply how long the little gate that normally blocks light from hitting the shutter is open during the time when you're taking a photograph. So if you have a very fast shutter speed, there's only a little bit of time when light is available to come through and hit the sensor, and the image will be relatively dark. And the longer you leave the shutter open, the more light is going to be coming through and hitting the sensor. So you can increase the brightness of an image by leaving the shutter open longer. The last attribute is ISO, which has a little bit of an odd history, which is, I don't think for this video, really worth going into. But basically the idea refers to how sensitive the sensor itself is to light, and it's essentially a simulation in a digital camera. What it means is when you have the value of ISO set at its base lowest level, every bit of light that hits the photosensors is recorded as is, and that is what determines the exposure of your picture. Now, if you increase the ISO value, essentially what your camera is going to do is for every bit of light that hits one of the photosites, it's going to treat that as twice as much light. So it's going to record twice the value by essentially doubling what it receives. And the result is that the image is brighter, but also the result is that it's sort of guessing about what the image would have looked like if there was more light when there actually isn't. So you may ask yourself, why do you need these three attributes to control exposure when they all do the same thing, which is either increasing or decreasing exposure, and hence increasing or decreasing the brightness of the picture? Well, the reason is because they all have separate sort of side effects which affect other aspects of the picture. And so you need to balance your settings of each of the three based on which of these sort of secondary effects you care about for your picture. For aperture, which is again the size of the iris and how open or closed the lens is, this has a secondary effect of affecting your depth of field. Depth of field refers to how far into the distance of what you're photographing are things in focus. So with a very wide aperture and letting in a lot of light, you have what's called a very shallow depth of field, meaning that the things that you focus on and your plane of focus are going to be in focus, but once you go a little bit beyond that, you're going to start getting some blur, going to start getting some lack of focus on the rest of the content in the image. As you start to close your shutter down and decrease the aperture size, you let in less light, but also as a secondary effect, you increase your depth of field. So things farther into the distance past your plane of focus will also be in focus. So for example, in landscape photography, you usually want the foreground and the background to be in focus at the same time. So you tend to use a smaller aperture, which will give you more depth of field. In contrast, very commonly in portrait photography, you want to have the person's face to be very sharp and in focus while the background is blurred out in a nice effect that's referred to as bokeh. And in that case, you most often use a much wider aperture with the lens more open, and it will give you that effect. This next attribute is shutter speed, and the secondary effect of this setting is that it affects the freezing of motion. So if you think about it, if the shutter is only open for a brief second, it's going to capture the world exactly as it was in that brief second. But if you leave the shutter open longer and the world that's being observed by the camera moves in the time that the shutter is open, then it's going to be able to record that motion. And as a result, depending on what you're trying to capture, you may want to use a shorter or a longer shutter speed to sort of get a different photographic effect. Generally, if you have something that's moving like wildlife or sports, you want to use a very fast shutter speed because that is going to freeze the motion and make sure that everything is in focus and sharp and you're not seeing any blur as a result of the subject moving in front of the camera. Now in contrast, for certain things where you want to actually intentionally capture the motion, you may want to leave your shutter open for a much longer time. So for example, a long exposure is when you intentionally leave the shutter open for a really long time to gather in a lot of light. And you may want to do this intentionally, for example, when you're taking a picture of something at night when things are much darker and you can only open your aperture so much. So once it's at its max value, the only way you can increase brightness, more or less, is to leave the shutter open longer. And if the subject that you're pointing your camera at is not moving, then there's really no harm in doing this in terms of the danger of capturing motion blur when you don't intend to. And really the only disadvantage is that it takes longer in terms of elapsed time that you're taking the picture to get the exposure that you want. The third attribute that we talked about is ISO, which again is the sensitivity of the sensor in your camera to light. And the secondary effect of this, which we kind of touched on as I was explaining it, is that you are increasing the amount of digital noise that appears in the picture. And this is a result of the camera essentially guessing at what would have happened if there was more light available. So like I said, an increased ISO value will increase the amount that the sensor perceives a bit of light, even though the light wasn't actually there. So if you think of like 1 bit of light hitting the sensor, it will treat that as 2 bits of light, even though if the sensor had been naturally more sensitive, it might not have been exactly equal to 2 of the amount of strength that the single amount was. So essentially it's guessing at what this would have looked like if it was brighter, and as a result the image is brighter, but you also have some very noticeable sort of distortions in the image in terms of little places where there's sort of dark and light bits that don't seem like they should be there, that don't look very realistic, or sometimes variations in color, also as a result of guessing at the value of what the light would have been if it was brighter. So why would you ever want to increase the ISO and intentionally increase the amount of noise in your resulting image when you could just change the aperture or the shutter speed in order to increase the brightness? Well, the answer is that sometimes you can't. So for example, in a very dim or dark environment, if you have your aperture open all the way, so it can't go any further, you can't get any more brightness from an aperture change, and you want to make sure that motion is frozen, so you don't want to get the blur from any people or moving subjects that are in the photo, then you can only increase your shutter speed a certain amount before you start to get that motion blur. And as a result, your only option for increasing the exposure of the image is to increase the ISO. So ISO is very commonly used when you're in a dark environment and you need to sort of simulate an increase in overall light without affecting the secondary properties of aperture and shutter speed. So that's the exposure triangle in a nutshell. Like I said, there's a lot of other videos that are out there on YouTube that explain the same stuff, and you can take a look at those if you still don't understand. A lot of them have nice diagrams that helps to sort of visualize the relationships between these things. I mostly just wanted to include it here for the sake of completeness and so that the next part makes sense. What I want to talk about now is my approach for how I decide what my exposure settings are going to be for any given image. On most cameras, you have three different modes: a manual exposure mode, a mode called aperture priority, and a mode called shutter priority. In the manual mode, you are in charge of setting the aperture value and the shutter speed and the ISO to form the results of this exposure triangle and get the exposure you want for your photo. In the aperture priority mode and the shutter priority mode, you have this very nice feature where the camera will essentially use its light meter to detect what the overall exposure should be based on the settings that you provide and sort of decide some of the settings for you. So in aperture priority mode, you set what you want the aperture to be, and the camera will figure out what the shutter speed should be given that aperture value so that the overall exposure comes out correct. And similarly, shutter priority mode is where you set the shutter speed and the camera will figure out what the correct aperture value is for that shutter speed to give you the correct exposure. Most cameras will also allow you to set the ISO either as a static value that can't change or in an auto mode where it will also guess what the ISO should be in the same way that it'll guess what the secondary exposure setting is in aperture or shutter priority mode. This can be a bit dangerous because, as explained, ISO has potentially the worst properties in its secondary effect is that you get increased noise when you increase the ISO. So most of the time you want to keep the ISO at a static setting and only increase it when you are sure that you actually want to do that. I found, at least with my cameras from Canon, that if you use auto ISO, it's very eager to increase the ISO when I would not have chosen to do that if I were using it manually. So for that reason, I pretty rarely use the auto ISO setting. I almost always leave it at its base value of 100, and I only manually increase it when a particular situation requires it. So in that sense, the exposure triangle is not necessarily as complicated or as difficult to figure out for a given photograph as you might think, because a lot of the time you don't have to think about it. It's really more about the distinction between, or the relationship between aperture and shutter speed. And for the most part, you can kind of ignore ISO unless you're in a particularly dark environment, and that's when that comes in. Most people, I think, use aperture priority mode, although there's certainly no right way to do it, and you're going to get the same exposure, the correct exposure either way if you meter correctly. So really it comes down to, for a given photograph, do you care more about the depth of field being a specific value, or do you care more about the amount of motion stopping power you have through your shutter speed? Which of them is more important in a given setting? Now for me, doing primarily landscape photography, I care more in general about the depth of field being a particular value than I do about the shutter speed, because there is no motion in the scene for the most part. Sometimes there is if there's a lot of wind or maybe an animal. But for the most part, I'm looking at static environments where the shutter speed, the secondary effect of shutter speed of stopping motion is not really relevant to what I'm shooting, and hence the most important value for me to select is the aperture, which affects how much of the scene is in focus. So almost all the time I'm using aperture priority. Now, even if you've decided that aperture or shutter speed is more important for your given photograph, you still need to be aware of both of them because both of them will affect certain aspects of what you're doing. So for example, with a very slow shutter speed where the shutter is open for a long time, even if the subject, what you're taking a picture of, doesn't move, if you're hand holding the camera, that is using the camera in your hands without a tripod, it's very likely that the shake from your hands and from pressing the button will introduce enough motion that the resulting image will be blurred even though your subject was not moving. And as a result, it's important that even when you're using aperture priority, you pay attention to the resulting shutter speed value that your camera automatically determines as the right exposure. And this is where ISO comes in. So the basic process when I'm taking a photo in aperture priority is, if I'm hand holding the camera, that is, I set the aperture based on the amount of depth of field I want, then I meter by pressing the shutter button halfway down, and then I look in the viewfinder what the value that the camera has chosen for shutter speed is. And I have to determine whether or not it's fast enough that if I take the picture hand holding, I won't get any motion blur from my hands shaking. Usually with my cameras, I have both of the main lenses I use have image stabilization on them, so I get a little bit of extra leeway that I wouldn't have otherwise. Depending on how still I feel like I can hold my hands, it's about a 15th of a second is where I start to be a little bit nervous about getting some motion blur in the image from my hands shaking. And so if we're at that point and the amount of the shutter speed needed in order to get the correct exposure is about that slow or slower, it's at that point that I consider increasing the ISO so that I can get a faster shutter speed while still keeping the same aperture setting, which will result in the specific depth of field I want. So more often than not, that's the procedure that I use. I set the aperture value for what I want. I check the shutter speed to make sure that it isn't too slow. If it's not too slow, then it's fine. I take the picture. And if it is too slow and I'm worried about getting motion blur, then I increase the ISO and I meter again and I check the value to make sure that the shutter speed has increased to a value that I am comfortable taking the shot handheld with. Now, if I'm using a tripod, then that becomes essentially irrelevant. And the only time that I'm concerned about that is if there's something in the photo that is actually moving. So in certain cases, if there's a lot of wind that is causing trees or other plants to move and I don't want to capture the motion of that, then this same process will apply where I may need to increase the ISO in order to freeze the motion. But for most static landscape environments where motion is not a concern, ISO can stay at its base level of 100 and the shutter speed doesn't matter and it can stay open as long as it's needed in order to get the proper exposure. And that's the main benefit of using a tripod for landscape photography, is that you're sort of removing from the equation this potential of handheld shake of the camera that can introduce motion blur that you don't want. On occasion, I will use shutter priority instead of aperture priority, and this happens essentially only when I'm photographing something that's moving quickly. So an animal or a person walking and trying to do any sort of street photography, if I'm trying to capture a person walking past a background and I want to freeze them in time so I don't see any motion blur, that's when I'll use shutter priority, because it's much more important to get the motion stopping power that I want than it is to get the correct depth of field. Generally, depth of field won't matter as much in those types of situations. And so in that scenario, it's sort of the reverse of the aperture priority setting. I set the shutter speed to something that I know for sure will cause the correct amount of stopping power of the motion that I'm trying to capture, and then I press the shutter button halfway down to do light metering. The camera will calculate an aperture that it thinks is appropriate for the amount of exposure that I should be getting. And then I check that value and I say, is this going to work for what I'm trying to do here? And if it's too high or too low, I may need to, or I may decide to adjust the ISO to cause the camera to pick a slightly different value for aperture. But in most cases, that's not necessary. I don't use shutter priority very often because, as I said, I do mostly landscape photography, and as such it doesn't really come up as often, and aperture priority is generally more useful for what I'm trying to do. That said, I do know of many photographers that use shutter priority as their sort of default setting, and that's perfectly acceptable. There's no right or wrong here. So if you have a workflow that works better for you that's different than what I'm describing, then that doesn't mean you're wrong. If it works for you, it works for you. I'm simply describing the way that it's worked for me and the way that I go about thinking about how I need to make my exposure settings changes when I'm taking a photo. And I found that this process has worked pretty well for me. As a still relatively new photographer, I find that the hardest part of this process is in guessing how slow of a shutter speed I can get without handheld motion shake from my hands shaking while holding the camera. I have a general sense of where that value cutoff is in terms of what's the slowest shutter speed that I can hand hold safely. Although I find that in my resulting images, I haven't always guessed correctly. So that seems to be the part of the process that is going to require sort of the most time and practice to get right. But overall, I find that this process is pretty effective for me, and it's especially easy when using a tripod because I don't have to worry about motion blur, and that way I can really just concentrate on the composition of my photo and get exactly what I want to capture. So I hope this has been helpful for you. If you have any questions, feel free to ask, and be sure to check out those other videos on YouTube about the exposure triangle that can go into maybe a little more depth if you'd like to hear more detail. And I'm certainly curious about what your process is for handling exposure and how you determine what settings to use. So if you'd like to let me know what you do, please do so. I'd be curious to hear what you have to say. Thanks for listening.